Joining us now is Jodi Kantor of the New York Times, who is a CBS News contributor. Her reporting on sexual abuse in the workplace helped inspire the Me Too movement. Jodi, thank you so much for joining us. Listen, there's a headline in the New York Times that says this. Good morning. R. Kelly's conviction represents a major Me Too moment for black women. But boy, did this take a very, very long time. I talked to one of the survivors yesterday that said, finally, justice has been served. Can you talk about what this actually means?
This is the question everybody's asking this morning. My colleague, Troy Clausen, who covered the trial, wrote a story that said the lingering question here is what took so long, given the overwhelming amount of evidence presented not only in this trial, but in documentaries and in reporting and victim accounts that we have seen for years. Especially
since, listen, this wasn't a case of he said, she said. This was a case of he said, she said, she said, she said, or he said, they said. What made it different this time, do you think?
Well, I think that if you watched the way this trial was laid out, the amount of evidence, the number of accounts, the varieties of evidence that were presented were overwhelming and compelling. We're talking about audio that was played at the trial with graphic details that were so disturbing that it's almost hard to mention them on television. We're talking about firsthand accounts from victims. And we're also talking about, this is one of the Me Too cases in which we're not just looking at an individual perpetrator, we're looking at a system of enablement in which women were silenced again and again.
I know, Jodi, I don't want that point to get by that you just said. The evidence that was in the case was so vile, so vulgar, so despicable that the judge didn't even want the public to hear it. I think that says a lot about what happened in this case. What message does this send to survivors, do you think?
Well, I think what we see is that the overwhelming power of the Me Too movement just continues to endure. And even after all of the obstacles, even after a trial a few years ago that did not result in a conviction, there is very little that is more ultimately powerful than these victims being willing to tell their stories, and they ultimately prevailed. You know, I spoke to Tarana Burke a few weeks ago about her new book, and what she said is we have a problem in that we tend to see the Me Too movement as a tennis match. Like when Cuomo leaves office, we say, okay, you know, 1 point for the women, for the victims. When Cosby gets freed, we say, ooh, you know, subtract 1 point from the Me Too movement. And it's time to, even while that scorekeeping is somewhat inevitable, the bigger question is, you know, what is Me Too making possible? And I think we see that in this trial, not only in the way the victims ultimately prevailed, but also in the fact that there was kind of a new legal theory that was used to bring this case. And you had a set of prosecutors who seemed very determined to find a way to see justice for the victims.
All right, Jodi Kantor, thank you so much. And he still has other cases pending. We thank you for your time this morning.